Danielle. Just waiting for that to start. Okay, perfect. So thank you, Danielle. So morning, everyone, and thank you again for joining. So welcome to our webinar specifically around unleashing the power of AI in testing. So thinking about how can we introduce AI in test and what we're doing now, and then we'll go over a few bits in terms of how we're going to structure this. But to get started, we'll do a bit of introduction of myself first. And so I'm George Malaris-Bobbitt, so one of the principal consultants within Ten10. I'm involved within automation, performance, and DevOps, and I also lead the AI testing practice within Ten10. And all those link quite nicely one of another, and AI is in that space for all those elements and beyond. And so automation leads in nice performance, thinking about APIs, and we'll talk about APIs and how we can think about it with an AI focus. Then performance, think about infrastructure, leads in nicely with DevOps, and hopefully wrap up nicely with a bit on every single part. So in terms of the contents, so massive question mark on AI. So what is it? How are we going to be referring to it? I think about generative AI, machine learning, NLP, and other bits. Talk about the current AI landscape that's focusing primarily on software testing. Then the AI in test, so the good and the bad. So it's not all good, but it's also not all bad either. Some practical applications, and that'll be throughout the webinar. Because what I want to showcase is some uses of how we're using it. It will be focused on some very basic examples, but what we do find is that a lot of those organizations that we're supporting and working alongside of, they're not using things that even if they have it available to them. And as such, what we're going to go in and do is think about some basic introductions of how you can get started or use a little bit, or at least give you some ideas of how you can go in and use it for those who haven't used it already. And so that'll be some demos throughout, and hopefully they'll all lead on well one after another. But of course, it is a webinar and it is live, so we'll see how it goes. And there's going to be one video recording for when I can't demo live, but I'll walk you through what that is as well. Then we'll go into testing AI with AI. So as an interest piece, and so think about how we're approaching testing something like a Perplexity clone, but we'll go into that in more detail to follow. So getting started, AI, what do we mean by AI? So in 2024, and basically last year as well, when we hear AI, we're typically thinking generative AI. But it is something that's always been present. It's always been around in some form, some shape or form, but we just haven't realized it. Or perhaps we haven't really thought about it because the best implementations of AI, so focusing more on machine learning and NLP and so on, and those are implementations that we just don't realize are present. So examples here like search, translation, and spell checking. So spell checking, things like Grammarly uses AI to think about how to go in and give you the correct results. They also use n-grams to make sure the context is correct when giving you the correct the correction first, or the grammar correction. Similar for translation, if you ever used a non-AI or mononom ML-based tool, you'll soon realize the translation can be quite poor. So going from English to Spanish, you can get some really wild results. And similarly for search. So recently, more so in the last couple of years, we start seeing things like Algolia, and they're getting more introductions in more sites and using semantic-based searches. And so this webinar will be heavily focused on generative AI with some mentions of machine learning algorithms that can be incorporated in day-to-day work. But one of my gripes is mentioning AI synonymous with Gen AI, and I'm going to be doing that exact same thing today. So do forgive me for that one. So when I say AI, in this case, it's probably going to be Gen AI. So I do apologize for that, but this makes it a little bit easier to communicate that out. And we do have our first poll, so I want to break the ice, get there interactions. So it's very much just out of curiosity, how often do you use AI in test? And so Danielle, if you're able to put that poll up on screen, should be a multi-choice answer. And should be multi-choice, and let's see how it goes. So that should appear now. So how regularly do you use AI? So is it multiple times per day, once a day, a few times a week, or a few times a month? And quite useful to get a quick little answer just so that we can go in and see what it's like. The results will be shared, obviously, of those on the call. You'll be able to see those results, but I'll say it verbally so that for the recording, you can see, what it is, because I don't think it'll pop up on there. So quick little vote, and then if we can just close it and share the results, please. So I got majority saying a few times a month. So 54%, about half, just over half, a few times a month, and there's a few kind of power users, say multiple times a day. That's roughly what we're expecting. That's kind of roughly kind of what this target audience for this webinar is. Just kind of go in and say a few examples of how you can go in and use it, powered by AI. So we'll move on from there. So thank you for voting for that one. But yeah, the results are on screen, and we'll share those hopefully one way or another on the recording, but it's been mentioned verbally as well. So the majority being just a few times a month. So the key takeaways here, so the key takeaways for this presentation is that AI is there to be used. It is providing value, and it can be a force multiplier in some areas. But as mentioned towards the start of the webinar, and the uptake is quite low. So most of us have interacted with a chatbot one way or another. So interacted with, say, ChatGPT, just give it a go, but you might have found that it wasn't giving you something useful out. Or maybe they're like, what do I even ask it? It's a bit boring. It's kind of cool, you ask it anything, gives you an answer, but what can you do with that? So you're probably not using it kind of day to day, and that's kind of well supported by the kind of poll results that we've seen. So it goes into just get started. So yeah, just give it a go. But obviously it's quite easy for me to say give it a go when I've been using it kind of day in, day out. So I go in a few examples, part of this webinar, to go in and say, here's how you can go in and use it. There is an automation focus on it. So it's going to be more kind of directed at those who are involved with more technical side of testing, so API and UI-based testing. But you do have to be mindful of security and data-related constraints. So, and we'll mention this kind of later, some organizations we work with, maybe some organizations that you're in at the moment, you may have kind of data constraints. So things like, an environment that is a copy of production, and quite literally the data you're interacting with is production data as well. So of course you can't just go in and grab a bunch of production data and just send it over to ChatGPT and assume everything's fine. There are kind of things in place, and you have to go and start thinking about where is that data going. So some organizations may look to having something more kind of on-prem, and we'll go over that as part of one of the demos to follow. So I think using things like Llama and Mistral. And then again, as mentioned earlier, we'll showcase some uses of how we're using AI within 1010, and those will have some demos. The demos will be heavily focused around UI and API testing, especially kind of the automation side. But I'll give you some examples of how you can go in and use it and try to get some kind of value out of it. So those are the key takeaways. So I mentioned that up front, so those ones I kind of you to kind of take off with you after their call. So it is providing value, just get started. Obviously easier to say than done. And then we'll show you how some things, so give you some examples of where you can get started. So we have the current AI landscape. There's a lot of stuff. So on this slide, I've given a few examples of bits. Ironically, I missed out ChatGPT, but let's see, got Gemini, Mistral, Claude, that's related to Anthropic, got Meta AI, Apply Tools, as an example. Then we have some copilots, so GitHub copilots, and one of the ball on the top right, that one's JetBrains AI. And then also mentioned Perplexity on the bottom left. That'll link into one of the demos to follow. But the key takeaway here is that there's a lot of tools available. Some are Gen AI, some are not. And basically the ability to make a kind of, I call it ChatGPT wrapper, but obviously a wrapper for any kind of large language model, has kind of flooded the market with basically thousands of mini apps, all designed to solve very niche problems. So some are basic, others are complex, and others do provide that real value. But a lot of it is just very much a wrapper for a large language model. So we start thinking, again, how do I interact with them? What do I use? How do I find out what to use? And it goes into how do you get started? Well, I'll be focusing on some of the basics, and we'll go into that soon. But again, we do need to focus on the actual problem. What is it that we're trying to solve? Now, I'm going to go in and have a bit of an example or a demo where it basically kind of goes through one of the points, which will be a recurring theme throughout this webinar, which is we don't really work in a perfect environment. So amazing self-documenting code, generated open API specs, or even just kind of generated code in general. We just don't live in kind of those worlds. And we see some greenfield projects, really pushing the boundaries, showcasing how they kind of solve these amazing problems. But not everyone's in that same situation. There's a lot of legacy code out there, and we start thinking about how can we go in and kind of interact with it, So one of the problems that we find is time spent finding information. So trying to get something like a schema or an open API spec. And then once we have that in hand, we would create some boilerplate code to interact with it. So the mitigation here not the solution really, is to use AI to generate some quick tests and kind of really emphasizing that it doesn't need to be complicated. So I'll be going through an example of how we do that. So the way we're going to do it, it's really kind of a two-step process. I'm going to basically simulate sending an API call, and I'm going to kind of generate some models off the back of it. And then you could then talk about how that's freeing up some time. So I'm going to exit the slides and I'm going to go into a sample API response. What we have here on the screen is I'm using something called randomuser.me/API. And what it will do is go and give me, as you probably imagine, a random user. Now this API, let's say I haven't got access to the OpenAPI docs, so I can't go in and consume it to produce kind of a model or an interface or whatever at the end of it, but I still want to go in and prove that this API response is working. And I want to make sure that if something changes, the test is going to fail. So one way we can do that is very simply, so again, just going to show you examples of kind of basic uses of AI, or rather generative AI, example using Gemini. It's going to go and copy the entire response, and I'm going to put it into Gemini, and I'm going to say something quite simple, just as simple as, given the JSON to follow, generate me a TypeScript, a test for TypeScript, generates me a set of TypeScript interfaces. I'm going to give it just the payload, or rather the response, and it'll go in and give me and generate me some code. So I can go in and use that, and I can then go in and interact with it. Interesting enough, this is the third time I do it, and it obviously gives me a different naming every single time, but the key bit is that the interface is created. I can go in now and use it. So I want to go in, so for those who, so this goes a bit more the technical side. Again, I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. What I could say is initially I have a GET request, and it's going to check a status code is 200, and I want to go in and confirm that, say, name title length is greater than 1. That's not a great test, and also as I think about how I'm going to interact with it. So what I'm doing with this interface, so I missed that part in explaining it, is try to now align it to an actual type and go in and test it a little bit further. So I've got the interface, I'm going to just paste it in a file I created earlier, so it was empty beforehand. And now what I can do is with that API response, I can now convert it, and I can convert it to make sure that I am kind of interacting with it properly. So I'm going to say, 1 second. So I should call this one here, random user response. So I'm say random user. Grab the, actually, I'll say person JSON. And then now I can go in and interact with this as an actual object. So say results dot, so in this case, I say the first instance, and then name, title, and then grab the length from there. And that's, actually, hopefully, for those who know a little bit around this, saves me a huge amount of time on having to go in and create all this. Because for those who've done it themselves in the past, it's quite a while to go in. It takes quite a lot of effort to go in and create it, and it's quite boilerplates and something that we can go in and use generative AI to go in and create. And from there, I can immediately create that into objects to go in and interact with it. So I can do the exact same test that I had here and do that using that interface that I created. And what's great is that if the API changed, I'd have to then change a string literal. I can just change this title to another variable combination. But that's, just the kind of first step. You could then say, well, I haven't really saved much time because that's kind of all worked up already here. So what I can then go in is extend that a little bit further and ask it to convert that into a AJV schema, which then allows me to then have a comparison. There we go. Did let me down a little bit. So I didn't give it the correct prompts, but goes in and creates an AJV schema. So that's not the full schema that I was hoping for, but I do have one that I had earlier, which is a bit cheating, I'm afraid. But it goes in and generates a schema, which I can then go in and compare against. And so go in and copy that over. And then I have a full schema for that API response. Again, that was just generated I know it's a bit of a shortcut there, but it was generated, or certainly this was originally generated to go in and use. So then go in and add that extra check to make sure that, yes, that API response is giving me something that I expected in the first place. So go in and say, now expect that, I have this code already, I'm just going to do the validate schema when I pass in the schema. So it's a random user response. And then I'm going to say person schema. And then random user. And I'm going to say to be true, best check, because we're trying to avoid just true or false checks. But again, now I'll go in and confirm that entire schema is correct or not. So go in and run that test, and it should just go in and pass. And now that I know, so very quickly, what I've just done there is go in and generate, basically from a payload, from an API response, an interface. I'm going to interact with it a little bit quicker than using kind of string kind of accesses, and also created a schema at the back of it. Now that does mean that given that, I can, if say the schema changes, or in this case, I'll break the schema to then get the test to fail, simulating something changing. So I'll go in, update the schema, and say, I'm going to say title is something that's not a title. Actually, it's one call with the required ones. 1 second. And then when I run the test now, the test will go in and fail. So start thinking, well, what did I just do then? Obviously, I rushed a little bit there, but what I've done is generated a schema off the back of this test, of this response, that can now be put in as I can put in into a kind of regression pack or whatever very quickly. And before that's something that would take a lot of time, obviously to go in and create a schema yourself. But then it goes into, did I actually need to create this? What was the alternative? What did we do before I could put that into an LLM? Are we just kind of shoehorning in AI? Are we just kind of just using AI for the sake of using AI? So I used it there, saved me a lot of time. For those who know how to create these kind of interfaces, they take a lot of time. And to create a schema, it does take a lot of time, and you want to make sure you get it right. But do we actually need to do it? The correct solution isn't necessarily to use AI to then, kind of as a boilerplate, to generate that boilerplate code. The correct solution is to actually have the OpenAPI docs being created automatically, and then the schema generated, so I can go in and consume that in the test and have it go in and confirm that the API is working correctly. So the problem shouldn't exist for me to then solve it through AI or using kind of generative AI to kind of generate that code, that boilerplate code, but which is going to be a running theme throughout the call of the webinar. Not everything is perfect, so just go in and give it a go. So it lets you kind of overcome that minor issue, saves you a bit of time, and hopefully you can take my word for it, creating those interfaces and schema will take you a lot of time, although if you were doing it manually, you would probably not create it for every single entry, but only the ones that you have to interact with. But again, the problem shouldn't exist, but again, not everything is perfect, so you go in and just solve it through in that manner. Obviously, you have the maintenance question. It's like, now I've got to maintain that schema and maintain those bits. And obviously, if you just regenerate it every single time it fails, then you have a problem because you're not really kind of testing it. So it's important then to understand the differences. And again, that's where you can start using GenAI again to go in and just offloading that kind of thought process to go in and say, here's two schemas, what's the difference between two generations? So it goes in and starts saying, here's examples of kind of go in and use it to confirm APIs are working correctly. So just give it a go. That's like one very simple example, which definitely saves a lot of time. When we hear Google, for example, say, X percentage of code is now generated through AI, that's probably one of the perfect examples of where you can go in and say, I'm generating loads of code for AI. It's all boilerplate stuff that take me a while to do, but isn't particularly complicated. And that's something we can go in and say, yeah, you're using it and it is saving some time. But just like, I guess for the majority of the call, we're kind of using it a few times a month. Sometimes you never really know when to use it. There's so much stuff out there, but it is very much a reminder. The slide's more of a reminder to say, there's a new tool out there, just give it a go through the usual proof of concept flow, establish an ROI as usual, and ensure it's appropriate with regards to security and data. So we'll have a separate slide in there where I kind of hammer that home a little bit more. But again, it's something that you can go in and do if there's kind of concerns around security and data, so have something that's on-prem. Don't be afraid to try something new, but also don't expect the world. So as we say that example, obviously I'm rushing it a little bit. It didn't give it to me the schema straight away. If I just kind of rephrase that a little bit, it would have been able to go in and give it to me, but I was able to kind of copy and over another one that had generated previously. But again, don't expect the world. It happens. You can tell it to regenerate, and it's probably going to work next time round. So focusing on the good and the bad, I'm just kind of drilling into that a little bit more. So the key takeaway is that it's a tool to enhance and not hinder or replace. So it's making you more effective. But similar to automation, we to get automation tests going in, what you find is it frees up that time. That doesn't mean that time just kind of goes away and it's managed by kind of reducing team sizes. You're just going to go in and make sure that your testing is that much better, or do other things that you are adding into your backlog all this time. So treat it as a way to kind of reduce noise. And we're going to talk about visual regression testing to follow. And then we start thinking, how can we use AI from a kind of team perspective? So we can use it to reduce complexity. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's more around trying to get it to treat it as a rubber duck. So we have juniors who may have kind of issues kind of reaching out or struggle to get certain information or whatever, not able to kind of reach out to kind of the seniors. They can then go in and treat it as an interactive rubber duck, and then allow them to tackle more complex problems. So it increases independence, because instead of their first port of call being to, well, assuming ask the Google things, check the documentation, that's normal. The first port of call is instead of reaching out to, say, a senior or someone else on the team, they go in and say, hey, ChatGPT, etc. How do I solve this problem? And it's fantastic for when you're trying to learn a new tool. So trying to get started with, say, playwrights, for example, maybe go in and say, how do I, deal with X scenario? Which go in, have that conversation around, give them a bit thought-provoking, and then hopefully from there kind of solves that problem. Hopefully not by just generating some code and blindly copying and pasting it over, but by also understanding what it is. So treating it as an interactive rubber duck. Or talking about rubber ducks, on the bottom right here, we've got a image of a rubber duck. That one is generated using Gemini, and it's going to lead in quite nicely into the bad in a couple of slides' time. But it told it, generate me a rubber duck, a yellow rubber duck, with a white background. So it fits in beautifully in this white background slide. But that was the best I could get to do. So even then, it's not going to be perfect, but it's good enough. So it's to help us, again, it's to enhance and it's not there to kind of to replace. So if I wanted one with a white background, there's other ways I can go for it. But that was a nice way for me to kind of get it going. And it's, in this case, it's kind of good enough for it. So talk about making tests smarter. So again, in that good section, think about how we can make tests smarter. So big issue with automated tests is that it'll only check what's been told to check. So in the case of the API test I showed earlier, that one talked about checking a certain length of text, not an amazing check. And then we have UI tests, then, well, we have, say login in, got username, password field, login button, maybe a remember me button, maybe remember me checkbox. But we're not checking anything else. We're not checking anything around it. We're not checking if the images are loaded correctly and so on. And the way we normally would catch this is by either explicitly telling it to check it, which can be quite exhaustive and tiring, or using visual regression testing. And so areas not being checked by the automated tool could change, which would be caught by a manual tester. So imagine probably while you're on the call, jumps in, goes in and interacts with a website, do day-to-day testing, and somehow like everything's messed up on the page. You notice immediately this looks wrong. Something's gone wrong there. How do I go in and catch it? Obviously, the automated test doesn't really know within reason. Obviously, you can kind of narrow it down with selectors, but unless it's kind of absolutely nuts, it's probably going to pass even with the wrong font is being used, the wrong title, positioning or height is being used. And that's where visual regression testing comes in, of which we've got a little bit of a demo to follow on that one. So traditionally, we would have like pixel by pixel comparison. So I've got an example of that one with Playwright to show you, and to say that you can get like the bare minimum in. And then we'll talk about a little bit about apply tools this one, I'm going to share a quick snapshots for it. Then it goes into, is this kind of the right way to solve it and solve this problem? Because suddenly now I have to like manage these images that obviously, again, it's going to be quite time it could consume a lot of time and quite time intensive to go in and check. So what can we do about it? Is there mitigation techniques? And then yes, so we've got a kind of snapshot accessibility testing. So I'll go over that one very shortly, very quickly rather. But these are kind of some things that we can start thinking about. And tools like Apply Tools, they talk about how to use AI for vision, but I'll show you some kind of screenshots kind of side by side. And then you can make your judgment, is it actually AI? But I'm not going to answer that one. So what I'll do now is talk about image comparison. So what I have is a website for this demo for pixel comparison. And it's going to go in and access basically this page. So I can see top right login button with Google. That's what I want to kind of draw your attention to. And then when I go into this alternate page, this one hasn't got it. So basically single sign-on button, OAuth button is either there or it isn't. So I'm going to go in and say, I've already recorded it to have a snapshot. I'll make that a little bit bigger. And I'm going to run a test that will go in and essentially fail because it's saying it's using the same snapshots as this one, but it's using it for this one. And of course, that big kind of button's missing. I'm not going to play that one. I'm just being a bit mindful of time. But what I do have is the example of that. So in this case, this is a pixel difference. So this one's going to go in and say, yeah, we can clearly see that one has the button, one doesn't. Then we have a diff, which conveniently didn't load. So I'll just run this test now. Let's get that going. And that'll then tell us what that looks like. I'll just run it and then see what happens. It's a live demo after all. This is my fault for that. There we go. So we have a side-by-side slider. So again, one with the button, one without. And then we have the diff. So we have it talking about all the pixels that are different. So obviously going in and having to fix this would be quite time intensive because you go in and say which one's right, which one isn't right. So isn't there a way to extract that out? And that's something that Apply Tools tried to do. So in their case, they just basically did the same, but a little bit prettier. But then of course, kind of in quotes, using the AI function to say, what's the issue? And they can start talking about the diff and start thinking about how can I make it a little bit smarter so it can handle some of these situations on its own. But again, kind of go into, do I need to use AI in this case? Is this kind of the right approach? Is this kind of this visual regression testing with AI, the best way for going forward? And it will all depend on your use case, that risk-based testing approach, thinking how much it's going to cost if it goes wrong? Is it something we want to invest in, and so on. But then it goes, can we just do things the traditional way? So going back to pixel by pixel, it's a bit annoying when a tiny pixel is wrong. Obviously, you have a threshold for that. But then it goes into, there are alternative ways, alternative things that we can approach, which is always being developed continuously. So things like ARIA snapshots. So I'm going to say, in this case, have sign in, for the ARIA snapshot, for those who don't know it, there's released recently by Playwright to basically go in and confirm basically kind of the ARIA, kind of the accessibility side of a page to see what the structures are like. So it goes in and says, is there a heading with sign in? Is there a button with this text box and so on? And that's a way that we can go in and just do kind of a budget pixel comparison. So this one will go in as pass, but this one will go in and fail. Let's run that one now and we'll see what that looks like in terms of the results. It's just a text-based one, so it's not the most consumable. And we'll get that one launched up. And we'll still go in and see what the differences are. So it goes in and says, text is kind of missing. So again, it goes into, do I need to kind of use AI in this case? Well, that's quite a complicated use case, but it goes into, could I just kind of offload it to Apply Tools? And it will all depend on your organization. But it is an example of a tool that we go in and recommend for visual regression testing. Again, just to capture one of the big problems of UI-based testing, which is and the fact that it's only going to check what's explicitly been told to go and check. So something you have to be careful of. But that's moving away from kind of the traditional LLMs, which I talked about in the first one. Then I'm going back one slide. Mentioned self-healing tests. Again, that's something that goes in and use models on occasion. But sometimes they say they're using AI, but all it's doing is, well, it depends on the tool, but some of them are just finding alternative selectors for the same content. And when selector fails, it just uses a backup selector and tells you what happened. But there's some that take it that little step further by saying, okay, make an actual decision based upon vision and location and so on to try to get the test moving, whilst also reporting what's going on. But then it goes into, is it actually a problem, or is it just a selector issue? Obviously, if you're more junior, you're probably more likely to be just right-click, copy XPath from the Chrome browser or whichever browser you're using. Whereas if you're more senior, you start thinking more of a crafted, bit of a more robust selector. So it goes into what it's trying to solve. So one takes more efforts than the other, and one is kind of quick and dirty. But sometimes you don't know what you don't know. So it goes into, this is a nice little way to kind of bridge the gap between that junior and senior. But then it goes into, are you just creating a load of technical debt? So again, a big question mark on that side. Then a bit more on AI and testing. So one thing I want to go over is kind of think about how can make automated tests easier to write. So there's a lot of bits that kind of try to say, AI, so NLP is one of the bits on this massive umbrella called AI. So natural language processing. And so there's a lot of kind of tools that go in and try to use it. And I've got a little demo here for something that we created in-house a couple of months ago to talk about how we can go in and kind of not quite push the boundary, but not far off it. There are tools out there that says, can I kind of use an LLM to completely drive my automated test? So what I've got is a little video recording. I'll be kind of snipping, fast forwarding my way through it. But long story short, what we have here is basically I create a test. So it's not using Gherkin or anything like that. It's just using it on a text file, just a simple set of instructions. So reject additional cookies, confirm messages about rejected cookies have appeared, click on a link, start now, and do a search. So giving it some really high level text. And then it goes into, is this what a test going to be like in the future for automation? Is it going to be like, just give it some instructions and just let the AI kind of just figure it out? So I'm going to press play on that. And see, this is a recording, just to make sure that it's all fine on here. And it's going to go pass it into basically a model. We'll see a snippet of the code of how it kind of drives it through in a second. But going to go in and open like the Gov sites. I can imagine when driving a test through an LLM. So the way it's working is it opens up the page, it grabs all the elements, including text, consumes it, parses it, and then throws it to an LLM and say, these are your elements that you got to interact with, and figure it out. This is what I want to do. And then the LLM will go in and say, click on this button, click on this, interactive here, and so on, and create kind of selectors based upon it. Now, with that in mind, so that's quite a short test. But with that in mind, we can go in and start thinking, okay, is that what our future is looking like? So that was done May this year, and the only tools I've seen around it, I think Apple Tools is doing one for kind of accelerating tests, but there's not many commercial tools out there. So then it goes into, do we then want to create our own? The downside of doing this, so in this case, as you can probably tell, the test was extraordinarily slow. So those would take you normally about less than 5 seconds to run, but it's took 40 seconds. And that's used going and sending off all that data to an LLM to process before making the next decision. That's a huge amount of computing resources and cost as well. And it goes into, okay, is it worth doing? I've vastly reduced the complexity of creating tests. Is that right? And then ultimately that'll be kind of up to the organization to decide on whether it is or not. For us, we did a more proof of concept to see if, what's the art of the possible, and also try to break it a little bit. So we told it, we won't see it as part of this demo, but we told it to say, confirm message about rejected work has appeared. And it would then pass because it found rejected cookies and assessed that that is the same as rejected work because it was close enough. It's so used to being positive. It's so used to just doing something and trying to find the way to get there. It kind of falls foul on that negative side. But of course, I can then be a bit more explicit and say confirm text with, in quotes, this exact text appears. But then it goes into, do I need to do that? Can I just use an NLP-based approach, similar to how Virtuoso is working? I think there's one snapshot of where it's just basically to talk about how data is inputted. Just get the right timing for that. Oh, particularly, I didn't. So this is kind of how it works. So basically, drive browser, So it goes in and consumes it. So I'm not going to go too much in this code that goes that lower level, but hopefully you can take my word for it. It is very much gets the prompt, does a bit of understanding on it, and sends it off to an LLM. In this case, this was running off an on-prem. We'll say on-prem, it was in the cloud, but on a private instance. And it was using, say, using Mistral 7B for that one. Again, it kind of shows that you don't have to use ChatGPT, for example, to do everything, or Gemini. You can use some smaller models for that. That was a bit of an interest piece. Talk a little bit about it, about how that can be used in test as well. And that's something that we could always do a future webinar on, more of a deep dive, talk about how we're interacting with it and what we think about it. But there will be a question, a poll towards the end to go into what do you want to see next, was it useful, and so on. So moving on from there, on the right slide, some of that isn't automation. So I'll talk about test data generation, test case generation, and then some red teaming combinations. So sometimes, they're like, oh, I've got to create some load of data, and it's really boring. And if you're a little bit, you're not as technical, sometimes it's just easier to just go in and just do that. Just go in and just say, Gemini, can you create me a load of data? So I can go in and just copy and paste here to generate me the following data, 5 records. Let's see if it does it this time. And, it's not my day. I did copy and paste this one from a one that works. Okay, let's try again. Generate the following data. Please create me records entries. Sorry, just for awareness, it's obviously, again, it's not perfect, but so go in for this example just for the sake of the demo. And what we'll do is, in that instance, is just obviously be a bit more verbose. And I tend to try to be quite short with it, just to get it to be a bit more creative. So in this case, I'd give it the same one to generate the following data, and it then gave in and generated it for me. And that's the joys of live demos, especially when saying how to use AI as well, but it is what it is. So it goes in and generates me some data, and then I want to say, okay, with that data, go in and create me another set of data that ties in with it, use Alice as well, the customer name, as the way to interact with it, and generates me more data. But then it goes into, is this the right approach? Do I want to actually be using an LLM, which is quite expensive token-wise, and to generate me some data? Or I can use a tool like Faker, and Faker can go in and generate me loads of content for free, or near free, just need some resources. But it goes into who's doing this. So on my side, more of a technical focus, I'll go in and say, I'm not going to use this. I'm going to generate it using Faker exactly the way I want it to. But for someone who's not technical, or someone who's kind of getting started, again, think about junior, bridging them up to do more complex stuff, then yes, it's quite useful for them to go in and say, okay, create me some data because I don't know how to do it. Or I can go in, I should be able to just continue this on. Can you create me a Python script using Faker to generate this? And then it says, okay, now that I know what data can look like, I want some more data, but I don't want to interact with it and get the scripts. And all I've got to do is pray that when I run this, it will go in and work. But it goes into kind of who's driving it. Is it someone technical or someone not technical? In this case, you can hopefully agree that someone non-technical can go in and ask for this input, copy it into a CSV, then interact with it. And someone who's probably a little bit more technical, junior bridging on to just kind of mid-level, go in and say, okay, I now want to figure out how to use Python or use kind of .NET or whatever to generate me that data. So it goes in and just does it. And of course, in this case here, it's using Faker, so that's all good with the English, the GP locale. And it also explains it. And it's like, I don't understand that, how this works. Explain it to me in a few short sentences. And then this goes into like, okay, what even is Faker? So it goes in and goes on it. But obviously, you wouldn't know about Faker. Well, you wouldn't know about Faker if you were to tell it to use Faker. If someone said, say someone more senior, press for time, says, just figure out what Faker, and they're like, how do I even get started? You could look at the docs, or you could interact with Gemini. But again, it kind of bridges that gap between technical and not so technical and help them kind of upskill by just having that interactive rubber duck. I mentioned test case generation and red teaming, so be mindful of time. For test case generation, I can also take that step further. So I can go to the web stream and go to the API test that I had and say, so I actually have, I'll show you the example here instead. So I said, given a test below, so I gave it a snapshot of a previous test, basically the test to do with, I didn't show that one, but it's another test to show for different API points to do with activities. And so given that snapshot, so I basically copied all this. I told it generate me some tests. So it goes in and starts generating me some tests. But of course, when I tell it to generate that, I need to go in and understand what it's doing. So instead of me going through that thought process of saying create, I'm going through that thought process instead of just review and make sure everything's fine. But once I check and make sure everything's fine, obviously converse with the AI assistant a little bit more, it then can start telling me, okay, use a scenario and be like, okay, that's really good. Testing for invalid data. So in this case, ID isn't a number, but rather an invalid string. But then you start thinking again about kind of junior side, that maybe get generated, but it's important for them to go in and ask, what does that mean? Why is this going to fail? And I can then go in and follow it up with a subset question. It says, explain to me why it should fail if I pass a string instead of a number for the ID. And of course, it's making some assumptions there, but it's a way to go in and help you understand what it is it's actually doing. So rather than me just copy and pasting blindly everything over, interact with it as well, because you'll be surprised by what it can come up with. So in this case, it starts talking about validation being enforced by the API schema. Obviously, we don't know if that's going to be the case, but we need to give it a go. So thinking about login, username, password, kind of testing, which hopefully we've all done at some point, you can start thinking about hundreds of combinations of what you can do. But imagine you didn't have anywhere to start from. You know, like username, password, invalid password, what else is there? And something as simple as not sending a password, not even the password being empty, can go in and cause an issue or kind of bypass kind of security. Again, it's quite rare for that to happen. But it goes in and starts saying different examples, kind of generate some combinations and a bit of red teaming as well. So you're just saying, okay, what about this and this and this? And why would this fail? And so on. Again, treating it as that interactive rubber duck. Okay, so probably going to go into that one in too much detail. There's an interest piece that I want to show that should be a bit more exciting. And moving on from there. So the not so good. I keep talking about how you can go in and get your juniors, especially those who don't know, or just even your seniors who just don't know that specific area, to go in and ask it questions, kind of guilt-free. But we can accidentally become complacent. So we may be kind of inherently reducing the amount of retained knowledge because we're just so used to passing the question in the chatbot, getting the answer, and just using it without thinking about it. And so that over-reliance on AI. But then conversely, if we're just doing that all the time, just using it, consuming the answer, and just pushing it out or doing whatever, we might just be assuming everything's correct. So there's maybe a danger of not actually understanding what it's doing and then becoming complacent. And then goes into like, what can we do? What can we do about that? And a lot of it kind of goes into kind of tools techniques, a bit of learning practice to say, just like how to Google something, maybe you need to learn how to prompt engineer something. Also, my prompt engineering wasn't amazing for this one, so it kind of fell foul a few times. But again, it goes into think about different ways to rephrase the question, what to do when you get an answer. Don't just assume it's correct. In my case, for example, I've had many instances where I generate some data, generate some code, and it doesn't work. The method just doesn't exist. The most frustrating thing ever, because it tells me a method or something I can use for my automated tests, and it just does not work at all. It's in yellow, red underline, because it doesn't exist. And they're like, oh, that's exactly what I wanted. Put it in, doesn't work. Disappointment is apparent. But again, be careful about assuming everything is correct. In that case, becoming complacent and just copying and pasting things over without understanding what it is. Mindful data security. I could hit the key points here. Just mindful. There's a bit I want to cover. Running a bit over time. Be mindful of the data and where it's been sent to ensure it's been agreed to. So I mentioned that example right at the beginning around production data and accidentally sending production data to the cloud AI service. Again, if you were interacting with, say, doing exactly what I just did, get a sample API response and converting it into a schema to add in as part of regression tests. What if that content included actual people data, some PII, to be mindful of GDPR, etc. So do you actually have approval to send it over? So kind of thinking a little bit further away from, say, kind of interacting with, say, ChatGPT or Gemini. I've got another example here. But just basically be mindful of tools, so including like ChatGPT and Gemini, that you assume are safe just because others use it. So just because you have someone in your team that's using, say, Gemini and using it on their privates or their kind of their personal accounts, and just because they're doing it doesn't mean that it's safe, doesn't mean that's secure. They may have kind of their own kind of agreements, so be mindful of it. Just don't assume it's safe because others use it. It's really important to call that out. So be careful of your data security in the organizations that you're in if that's apparent. I mentioned the example Grammarly here. So so don't kind of dissuade, kind of distract from the overarching kind of AI in test. But I mean, how many of you who interact with Grammarly, for example, kind of assume it's safe because others use it, but then kind of forget or not realize that all that spell checking is being done on a remote server. So everything you have Grammarly on your browser is potentially being sent off to go and get checked and then back to you. So an example there where again, to be careful to kind of distracting you too much from the main content, but don't just assume it's safe because others use it. Do you kind of make sure it's kind of approved within the organization where appropriate? So I mentioned that one there, just again, not to distract you, but as an example of, be careful of your data. So then we're going into an interest piece. This is one I hope a little bit more exciting, at least on my side anyway, and about how we're testing AI applications. So I've got an example to show you. Basically, it's like an internal version of ChatGPT search. It's similar to something called Perplexity. For those who've used it, may have used it. And there's lots of copycats kind of out there. And I'll be using one of those copycats, an open source implementation rather, called Firefel. And I'll show that in a second. But what I want to kind of get across is think about how we're using AI to test AI, a few little techniques there, and see how it goes on that front. But what we're seeing with a few organizations or clients is that they're looking to implement ChatGPT or similar a version similar to ChatGPT search to search either their document stores or kind of client material, etc., to generate a response. So something like an RFP kind of answer or assistance, and to go in, consume loads of history, say something that's kind of on-prem data, and then go in and give a result based upon it, what you did and so on, and how you can solve a future problem. But the focus for this interest piece is around the integration of the model, so away from testing the actual model, away from testing, say, Llama or Mistral, the actual models, but more focusing on kind of the application of the models. The model's somewhere and it's kind of being interacted with, and we'll go over that in a bit more detail. So for that one, I'll have part one. So this is what it looks like. I may have come across something very similar to this. So basically it says, ask me anything. It's currently pointed at the internet, to kind of the wider internet. So what we typically see for clients is that it's pointed at a private data store, like Elastic or some Quadrants or some other vector database, and then go in and ask it questions. In this case, I said use Llama 3, and let's go and say, what is Farfel? Talk about pasta here, but I don't want to kind of distract you with that. What I'll do instead is give you an example of what is performance testing. And this one's using Llama model. And I'm not so fussed about what the content is in this level. Obviously, grab some sources, has some relevant images, but it gives me a response. And hopefully, by a quick little scan of that response, it looks okay. It's got, formatting's okay, the citations are present, and so on. So it goes into like, how do we approach testing this? Because are we going to check the actual content? Are we going to check the structure? Are we going to check what data retrieved to answer the question? Obviously, there's a huge question mark on what's the best way to tackle it. But then what I'm going to do is kind of throw you all off by showing another instance where I ask the same question, but use a different model. So in this case, it's using Mistral rather than Llama. And this is something that happens to us for our internal tool. So we used Mistral, and we then updated it 3.1 to 3.2 or something like that. Can't remember the exact version off the top of my head now, but upgraded it, and suddenly the response that looks like this, nicely formatted inline citations, would always give us a numbered list. So we have a problem which goes, how can we catch this with regression testing? How can we catch this with automated regression testing rather? When we think about it manually, it's an instant, obvious check, because I can immediately see this looks wrong, this looks more correct, obviously without even checking the content. So it goes into a big question mark. How do we approach this challenge, this problem where the answer may be correct, but it's done incorrectly? So we can't use visual regression testing because it'll just be crazy anyway. But then it goes into, okay, there's a few things here. We've got our citations and so on, but it goes into how do we actually go in and do it? Big question mark on that side. Stepping away from it, start thinking about how do we go in, attach it, test it from different responses rather than the formatting in this case. And what I want to go in, I was a bit mindful of time, is talk about a few little techniques that we're using to go in and test it. We do something called, what we can apply and calls echo testing. So we'll rephrase, say, what is performance testing to give us different combinations of it. So they say something like, how is performance testing applied? Just rephrasing the same question. And similar to metamorphic testing techniques, it should then give us the same answer, or roughly the same answer. But then how do we compare load of these answers? So then it goes into, okay, I can compare two answers, maybe semantic analysis, see how similar they are. And from there, I've got a quick little walkthrough of 2 bits. So for those who don't know, semantic analysis, you basically have text put into a transformer model, and it'll give you a massive array of numbers, and you're basically seeing how similar numbers are together. You do to kind of just basically see how similar kind of two models are. So over here, I'm saying, welcome to the webinar, and hello and welcome to the webinar. It's a very simple comparison, and we're going to hopefully expect that, yes, they are quite similar. We got this extra hello, which is a bit strange, but it's, you can say, grammatically completely fine. Hello and welcome. So when I run this, it'll go in as pass. I might just skip the test, but we'll go in and pass, but then start thinking, okay, what's it actually doing? Well, it's checking for, again, similar words. So when we test or check anything, we want to add that negative spin on it, because we want to assume everything's fine just because it told us it passed. So we start thinking, how do we go in and break it? So from here, it's taking a little bit while because it's loading up the model. I'm going to go in and say, welcome to the webinar, and webinar there to welcome. Obviously, we want that to fail, and just because being a bit slow to run, this in fact will actually pass. So these will say these are actually similar, and then you're thinking, great. So semantic analysis is that is that kind of line strike through, and not really. It still gives us some value, because then we have some other examples where we can do a bit bigger content and start saying bigger chunks. So there's a way we can go in and compare it. But what I'm trying to say as a key takeaway, although I'm conscious I am rushing it a little bit, is when it goes into testing AI with AI, what I'm trying to say is you've got to be a little bit careful on that front. So one thing, if you're interested in thinking about how you test AI with AI, I might probably do a follow-up webinar, but semantic analysis is quite useful. But then there's also other ones like rogue metrics and blue scores. So I've got a bit of text on the screen, probably more useful for those who, when they watch the recording, but it starts talking about kind of high level precision in this case for rogue scores. So talk about how similar kind of words are and how they kind of work and map to each other in terms of sequences. But again, so in this case, this will give us, we've got to be quite careful. So again, think that negative hat on. So it goes in and says, this one's predictions, performance testing assesses how system application functions on the different workloads, fair, valid statements. And then the ground truth is a bit more verbose and a different way of speaking, but it misses out on similar words. So it gives us a low score in this case. Just take my word for it, unfortunately. And then in this case, we have one given as a high score. So telling us evaluating responses simply because it contains more similar text. This is quite useful for doing what's known as retrieval augmented generation evaluation. But conscious I'm rushing a little bit, hoping to wrap up for 11. But what we have is a few things that are worth checking out in the future. So if you're in the same position, think about how you can go in and test it. What we would recommend is kind of having a model answer and then kind of testing against it, and using different ways. So you probably end up combining semantic analysis, rogue score, blue score, and then having some judges, some actual LLMs that go in and say, is this correct? And that's how it will catch this formatting issue, not through the blue and rogue scores or semantic analysis, but rather through a judging element LLM. So it's there on purpose to just to say, is this model answer similar to this responded answer? And then we have some other checks on the screen as well. So apologies for running over a little bit, and we do want to be able to get a chance to answer some questions. So that leads into our next slide. On are there any questions? Again, apologies for running over a little bit. I was hoping to kind of go into a bit more detail on AI and testing AI.
Thanks, George, for that. That's super helpful. And I think we could take some time to answer a couple of questions. And if anyone has to drop off, we'll send you the recording so you'll see it all. So we've had a few come through. So the first one that's come through, I'll put on Answer Live. A lot of Gen AI tools are wrappers around ChatGPT. Does it need to be this, or can it be a wrapper around Gen AI things?
I've got you. Thank you. So yeah, thanks for asking. So long story short, it doesn't need to be. So you can just interact with ChatGPT or similar other LLMs directly, and that's absolutely fine. But you've got to bear in mind these wrappers, sometimes they're in their niche, they're very much focused on a kind of solving a certain problem, and sometimes quite nice to go in and interact with it. The wrapper instead, obviously you're paying a premium for it, but that's hopefully been proven to give you the correct answer, and overall that may kind of reduce time than you trying to do it yourself. So there's always that. Do you want to spend time doing it yourself, or do you kind of want to kind of offload that to kind of use something that's working now and get going? That'll be part of kind of the ROI assessment, but it goes into the overarching point, which is just give it a go.
Thanks, George. And then we've got another one. You mentioned security concerns a little bit and looking at other external factors. So how can you mitigate and be mindful of those security constraints?
So for be mindful of them, essentially just know where your data is going. So you're obviously sending that message over to ChatGPT or some local model, like where is it actually going? What does it contain? And if it's leaving your company boundary, obviously be very careful of. So don't be afraid to kind of reach out to your kind of head of IT and similar, or those who kind of know a little bit more around it to understand what you can and can't do. Because sometimes there may just be an element of just getting a bit of training on it to know what you can send. And there are also ways to add extra kind of layers on top of them, on top of kind of your ChatGPT use cases to say, okay, catch any instances where PII is found. So example for that one was like David Meyer, for example, where we think kind of where it will just kind of break ChatGPT when you're using it or interacting with it. And that's an instance where basically there's something else checking to make sure the answer is not harmful and so on. So you get that implemented on the company side. But again, that all depends on the use case, but just be careful about what you're sending and where it's going to.
Helpful. Thanks, George. And then we've just got a couple more. How do we keep up to date with updates in this space? What do you find most useful, George?
A lot of it goes to word of mouth, just making sure good comms around the organizations, having good chats, webinars, and so on. I found out about ARIA snapshotting, for example, through a LinkedIn post. So someone called Callum Porter created a post. I completely missed it on the playwrights and release notes, and that's actually how I found out. So going through them, there's also other news sources like Daily Dev and Reddit, for example. Just a lots of kind of out there, but ultimately the best way is word of mouth and try to kind of attend webinars like these.
Thank you. And then last one, which we'll wrap up with. I've heard about prompts and prompt engineering, so I know that was something you talked a bit about during the webinar. But the question goes, should staff be given guided training on prompting, or is it just something that should get better by doing?
Tricky one. Ultimately, it goes into how it's kind of what the answers you're getting. Obviously, we don't get kind of taught how to Google search things, but it's something you kind of improve over time. But I'm sure some of you may realize what kind of thought in hindsight. It'd be really nice if I was told exactly how, best way to kind of search for things rather than phrasing it, how do I solve, etc. So it goes into, it's quite good to have at least some guidance or some steer on best ways to prompt engineer. Obviously, I fell foul on that one a little bit on this presentation for 2 issues. But again, there's ways of rephrasing it to get the answer you're after, a bit of follow-ups as well. And once the model has that context, give you that answer. But sometimes you just don't know what you don't know. So it is good to find ways to get some training, at least a short session on that in terms of kind of top tips and tricks. Okay.
Right, that's it then. We're just past 11, so we'll finish it there, and we'll send you guys the recording afterwards. And we'll also just pop in a couple of questions and ask him for any feedback for what our next webinar will be. But yeah, big thanks, George, for taking us through that. It was super helpful, and thank you to everyone for attending.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers, thank you.